So in the Vox video, we see some of the elements and language that is very much mobilized on Drag Race. And while voguing and drag are different kinds of performances, they come from similar communities. So not everyone who does Vogue will do drag, and not everyone who does drag will Vogue. But the notion of a house, of a voguing house or a drag house, those are very much connected. And as the video talked about, houses, whether it be Vogue or drag or both, very much functioned and still function in many ways as surrogate families. So voguing culture is still very much alive, as is drag culture, obviously. And so we can even see some mainstream um, uh, depictions of voguing culture. If anyone's watched the show Legendary, it was kind of the first mainstream show where you had Vogue houses compete for a title. And we'll talk a bit about that show later, and I'll show some clips in week 6. And earlier in the class, I showed you a clip from the show Pose. And Pose is a show on FX. As I think now has 3 seasons. That is based in 1987 in New York. So it's the height of the AIDS crisis. But it also really shows the importance of a voguing house, of Vogue balls, of that kind of culture for the Black and Latinx communities, particularly queer and trans, in the 1980s and 1990s. So these houses were not only kind of refuges for queer and trans folks of color who were either disowned from their families or didn't have any families to be connected to a community. And so they were either kind of led by a mother or a father. Typically, it's a mother. Um, doesn't necessarily mean that that's not necessarily indicative of a gender identity, but largely the house mothers were trans women of color. And so we see this really important queer kinship structure come out of these particular scenes. And RuPaul uses a lot of this language on the show. For instance, even the notion of the runway comes from Vogue culture. A lot of the language, for instance, Extravaganza was the name of a legendary Vogue house. And so when we say legendary houses, these are kind of speaking to the original or very iconic Vogue houses. So ballroom cultures have a long history. We can even trace some major ballroom and drag balls happening in New York in the 1920s, and there's evidence of them happening even in the late 1980s, or sorry, late 1890s rather. And I've mentioned the Harlem Renaissance, which primarily happened over the 1930s in New York in the Harlem district, which was has historically been a Black community. We do see the instances of ball cultures and drag balls. So in these early drag balls, um, they were very much peopled by folks who were of many different racial backgrounds. There were many instances of racism and classism in many of these competitions. So we do see this very purposeful split happening in the 1970s between scenes that were very much led and kind of controlled by white gay men, um, to kind of have more of a scene that centered people of color. So later on in the class, we will watch clips from the movie The Queen, which I believe is available on Netflix. So The Queen depicts a drag pageant that happened in New York, I believe in 1967. So this is even before Stonewall. And this film is a really interesting documentary that looks at people participating in these pageants. So it wasn't a Vogue pageant, it was, or a Vogue ball rather, it was very much kind of a traditional pageant, but peopled by gay men and trans women. And there was this particular instance at one of these pageants in 1967 that's documented in The Queen, where Pepper LaBeija, who would then become the first mother of the House of LaBeija, sorry, Crystal LaBeija. Pepper LaBeija was her protege, but Crystal LaBeija had this very public critique of the racism that was happening in the pageant. So prioritizing girls who were more quote unquote passing, who were light skinned, who were more binary presenting. And so Crystal LaBeija started holding her own balls in 1972, and this kind of started the House of LaBeija. And so it's not just in New York. We do see Vogue culture in many other cities. It did start in New York. It is popular in other cities with larger Black communities. So we do see voguing and ballroom cultures in Atlanta, in Detroit. And later on, we will look at some local voguing cultures. So there is a small but quite extraordinary voguing culture in Vancouver that we'll look at a little bit, that is very much connected to drag scenes, but not necessarily coming out of drag scenes, uh, but having its kind of own particular culture. But there's lots of intersections, as they tend to be, both tend to be largely peopled by queer and trans communities. So houses will compete or walk in these balls in different categories. And the categories tend to be structured around particular gender embodiments, but also clothing styles. So there's a lot of elements of costuming and kind of intertwined different aesthetics with dance, with voguing, with posing, and kind of presenting a particular attitude. So on the right, we see an image of Willie Ninja, who is, as the video talked about, kind of seen as the godfather of voguing. He really created a lot of these early styles that are seen as kind of the originary Vogue poses and styles. So we'll look at that in the next few slides. So similar to other forms of dance, voguing has multiple styles. And so this first style, this old school voguing that Willie Ninja kind of created, blends a lot of different, it blends elements from a lot of different forms of dance. It's really based around poses of supermodels in fashion magazines. There is a lot of ballet, but there's also a lot of use of sharp edges, geometric shapes, even using pantomime. So a lot of hands are involved. We do see elements of karate, things like that. Willie Ninja was very, very interested in different forms of Asian style dance, and used things like hip hop, house, and fashion all blended together to create a particular dance style. So some categories include things like face. So you maybe have heard on Drag Race people, using the phrase "face, face, I give face." So face is particularly highlighting someone's facial structure. So the dance that or the poses that will be enacted in those particular categories will highlight the face, femme queen realness, Banji girl executive realness, eleganza, extravaganza. So we've probably, if you've watched Drag Race, you've heard of these categories. So the ballroom scene is the basis for much of the language or the gay slang and the rituals that we see on Drag Race. For instance, the runway and lip syncing really pulls from both Vogue and ballroom and drag scenes. So some of these phrases that come directly from the scene, and we do see in Paris is Burning, things like "you better work," the notion of reading and the notion of shade, and things like "the library is now open." So these kinds of terms have a particular history. So here, oh, never mind. I'm going to put up this clip that you can watch right after I end this video. My apologies.